started?
It's on.
Okay, great, wonderful. So yes, so what I'd like to talk to you about today is a sort of this idea that I'm kind of calling a new approach. And I invite you to, at various points in the talk, I'll take a deep breath and make a little pause and make some space for questions. If you have any clarifying questions throughout the talk, you're welcome to just jump in and ask me about any of the things on the current slide. Otherwise, I'll leave a lot of room for discussion at the end of the talk so that we can get into any of the topics that I've covered in the talk. And you're also welcome to follow me on Twitter and add any follow-up questions or address me in my email at Northwestern, which I have at the end of the slides. All right, so let's just go ahead and jump in. So this is a beautiful sculpture by a Japanese artist called Mariko Mori, and I like to start with this slide because it reminds me of this kind of complex phenomenon that is speech, right? When we start thinking about what is speech, we kind of have to imagine that it's many interconnected mechanisms that are working together and kind of winding around in this way that are not always obvious. And our approach as, let's say, if you identify as a linguist, and one approach as a linguist is to try to zoom in on one of these parts or try to take a specific perspective and take that as the starting point for your investigation. And so here I've drawn a little very simplified caricature of the scientific method of how we might approach the problem of speech and language. So we might start by developing some hypotheses and predictions that derive from those hypotheses, generate some observations from either experiments or existing data, and then assess how well that matches with the predictions of our hypotheses. And based on that assessment, we move to the last stage of theory development, which is kind of back to where we started, right? So we develop our theories based on the assessment of whether our predictions were correct or not. And one thing about this picture is that there's kind of an implicit assumption about, like, all hypotheses are domain specific, right? So we're kind of even when we're making our first hypotheses, we're already working with a set of assumptions about what we're doing. And whether you identify yourself as a linguist or a psychologist or a psycholinguist, we're kind of, we feel like we're working in one of these tracks, right? So I, as a phonologist, trained as a linguist, as a phonologist, I thought what I was doing was making hypotheses about phonology and making, phonological observations about phonological data and assessing those, and from there, developing my theory of phonology, until I realized that there was also a lot of interesting things going on in the world of speech production. And what I saw there was kind of the same thing, where it's like, I'm making speech production hypotheses, speech production experiments, and speech production based assessments of those observations. And what I'm advocating for now, what I kind of started feeling very strongly about, is that these two things cannot be, but these two things can be much more fruitful when they're studied together, right? Even when I was a quote unquote just a phonologist, I was making a lot of implicit assumptions about speech production, right? So there's no way to get away from any speech observation involves speech production, right? So we can't say that all of our observations are only phonological observations. So by thinking about it in this way, we can actually make a more nuanced assessment from each perspective, right? So when I'm making my assessment of my observations, I can do them in the context of my hypotheses about speech production, okay? So that's the very general approach that I'm talking about. And so what I'll do today is kind of walk through this cycle for connected speech and the specific phenomenon I'm looking at. All right. So the first thing we start with is kind of an observation about speech behavior. So the kinds of observations I'm professionally obsessed with, let's say, are this kind of this acoustic and articulatory variation for a single speaker and a word in a particular context. So here I have these waveforms and spectrograms for this exact same utterance of the phrase "cute iceberg," which is a phrase that I asked some experimental participants to say. And this is the exact same participant pronouncing this in two very acoustically and articulatorily different ways, right? You can see that there's some, the vocal cords continue vibrating throughout this period of T here, whereas they stop and there's like some aperiodic noise in this realization of the same, quote unquote, same word or same sound, right? It's what we as phonologists might think of as the same sound, comes out in two quite different ways. Okay, so how can we get a handle on this phenomenon? If we think about this in terms of phonological theory, there's a term for it, right? We call this phonological variation. So when you have many possible pronunciations of a single word or a single sound in the same phonological context from the same speaker, we call that phonological variation. So if you have a word like great, you have all these three possible pronunciations of that, whatever the sound is at the end of great, probably a T, in front of the word artist specifically, but more generally in front of any word that starts with a vowel. The fact that any speaker or speakers of a particular dialect that have this variant, let's say, could in different situations use any of these three pronunciations as phonological variation. And I think it's worth pointing out that that's actually not something that's something that's defined under the assumptions of phonological theory, or at least some phonological theories. Or it's kind of something that feels like a phonological explanation, but it's also something that's not really well defined in a theory of speech production. So the kind of, I want to broadly say, so Audrey Bürki wrote a really wonderful article called "Variation in the Speech Signal." But what's kind of surprising to me is that there's like it's kind of a catalog of different types of variation that look very familiar if you're a phonologist and maybe a little foreign if you're a psycholinguist, for example. So given that this seems to be a phenomenon that is amenable to phonological concepts, how can we give a phonological explanation for why this happens? Well, one more observation before we get into the explanation part is that phonological variation is not distributed evenly throughout speech, right? So if for any given word, the individual sound, for example, if you take a T in the middle of the word catapult or catapult to caricature it, 94% of the time, between 94 and 99% of the time, it will come out as a single variant, right? So there's not as much variation when the particular sound is inside of a word, as opposed to when the T is at the end of the word, like in a word like cat, if you put the word attack after it, even though it's the same T context or schwa context, it's much less likely to come out as the variant, the flat variant here, this particular variant, right? So there's less predictability in which type of variant you're going to get. In particular, there's a lot more variability at word boundaries, right? So that's not that there's something special about this word and this word. It's a broader generalization about word internal context versus when the sound is at the edge of a word. So why is this variation more present at word boundaries? So some phonological explanations for this could be, so the prosodic locality constraints is one of the things that have been proposed to explain this type of variation. So you can have this kind of higher order organization of words into phrases and then larger intonational units. And that organization itself is something that can vary from utterance to utterance, right? So sometimes you say the cat escaped, and sometimes you say cat escaped. It works a little bit better with attack, but in any case, the organization is different. Another approach to this phenomenon, another explanation for this phenomenon not applied to this problem in particular, but kind of more generally applied to other variable phonological processes, is that that mapping itself is probabilistic. So the mapping from the T or D to a surface flap has some is inherently probabilistic, right? So I won't spend too much longer on that. I just wanted to mention them as we move towards thinking about a different perspective on phonological variation. So the starting point for this different perspective is to actually move into a different theory and think about speech production planning. So I'll give a brief overview of some ideas in speech production planning. So there's like many different kinds of approaches and theories, and there's all the fine details are still being worked out, I would say, but I'm just going to address a few basic assumptions that I think everyone would more or less agree with in this field. The first being that speakers don't know all of the details of what they're about to say before their mouth starts moving. Yeah. And a kind of related idea that we can plan word forms incrementally. So while we're speaking, we can also do the work of planning the things that we're about to say. So there's a kind of interleaving of articulation and planning. And this makes sense if you think about the fact that speakers have to find a balance between planning as far as possible in advance, which allows them to speak fluently, but also not holding too much detail in their working memory, which can lead to interference from words that are coming later in the sentence, kind of appearing earlier, and then you have very errorful speech. I actually recently heard a talk by John Alderetti, who's this kind of expert on speech errors, and he built this huge database. And he said that if in listening to spontaneous speech, as he was annotating it, if you were finding less than one error every, I think it was like every 3 minutes, then you're not listening carefully enough. So this is like, so speakers are constantly struggling with this balance. So the concept that I really want to focus on is this idea of the planning window. So how far in advance are people planning? So let's look at two kind of very limited scenarios. So if we think about a scenario where we have a smaller quote unquote planning window, we can imagine that we're trying to find the words to describe this image, and we come up with the word. First of all, we come up with the word big, and then we send it off to our articulatory system, right? And so we've planned the word, and then we immediately ship it off and start articulating it. And at the end of that articulation, we come up with the next word, pointy, and then we ship it off. And then finally, we come up with a noun, ears, and then we ship it off. And we create this kind of piecemeal, piece by piece utterance where we're planning very just in advance of what we're about to say. On the other hand, with a larger planning window, we could imagine that we take a little bit more time to plan out, right? So we have a longer startup cost at the beginning. So we are maybe like silent for a little bit longer in at the beginning while we're trying to plan what we're about to say. But the advantage is that when we end up saying this in this whole phrase, we might come up with something much more integrated, right? So instead of saying big pointy ears, we might say big pointy ears. And we have a nice integrated phrase that sounds possibly more natural. All right. Any thoughts or questions about the big pointy ears? All right, so based on these two scenarios, which one's closer to what speakers actually do? It turns out that it depends. It depends on whether speakers are forced to speak quickly or whether they have a chance to, for example, read or prepare what they're about to say in an experimental context. It turns out that different speakers might adopt different strategies, so it might just depend on the person, which is something that was found in a couple of speech production experiments in post-hoc analysis. And it also depends on prior experience, whether prior in the sense of like your whole life prior to just now, and also recent prior experience, like what's the sentence that you just said before this one. So the conclusion that I kind of arrive at that it's maybe this is where I'm kind of pushing on the frontier of production theory, is that the planning window is variable. So this is a sort of claim that I want to work with, right? So there's lots of evidence in the literature that I think is pointing towards this idea, but it's not something that's been explicitly tested yet. And coming back to the sound pattern that we were looking at earlier, the kind of big claim of my work is that phonological variation, so this problem that we defined in phonological terms, is actually partly attributable to the variation in the speech planning window. So I have this concept of phonological variation from my phonological observations, and I relate it to this idea that speakers actually have a limited amount of planning resources for planning in advance. So that we can take this idea of a mapping from an underlying T to a surface flap in this particular context, and keep that as our kind of phonological piece of the explanation. And what we add to that are some assumptions about the architecture of speech production. And we can, from that, derive the fact that speech planning itself limits the availability of this upcoming context, let's say, so the next word that's coming up in the utterance. And that will affect the input to rules or, whatever derivation you prefer. And this is also, I won't talk about today, but I think that there's a lot of potential to talk about some indirect feed-forwards effect of syntactic structure or planning in this context with this hypothesis. So that's what I call the production planning hypothesis. I also wanted to, this is something that I kind of thought about more recently, but if we try to take a different perspective on this and frame this idea as a hypothesis about speech production, we can say that we can use sound patterns to think about whether it's true that the planning window varies within individuals. So I kind of shared with you this claim earlier that the planning window is variable, and we can use the sound patterns themselves to test this hypothesis that variation in the speech planning window within speakers leads to specific patterns of phonetic variation in speech or phonological variation in speech. Okay. So to elaborate that on that hypothesis a little bit more from the perspective, from the psycholinguistic perspective, the following word in an utterance. So if we think about we're currently uttering this word, and then the following word can only have an influence on the current word form that we're planning and uttering if they're planned within the same window, right? So if we're trying to say a phrase that starts with the word great, the pronunciation of great can't be affected by artist unless artist is being planned prior to when you're articulating this. I think it's kind of an intuitive idea, but it's worth spelling out a little bit compared to a scenario where you have a larger planning window. You have great artists, then you're able to plan the flap pronunciation because you know that the next word is going to start with a vowel. And that's something that the idea of having a variation within an individual between a smaller planning window and a larger planning window is something that we can see playing out if we kind of adopt this perspective of phonological variation between these two sounds, right? This mapping between a T and its surface variance depending on the phonological context. All right. So how do we test these things? How do we test these hypotheses? I've used two methods that I think have proven fruitful. Firstly, we can reevaluate existing data, namely go look for existing corpora and look at the patterns that we find there. And secondly, we can generate new data through speech production experiments. A more broad recipe for detecting speech planning effects in phonological patterns. Step one, find a variable that acts as a proxy for planning difficulty. So you want to look for a non-phonologically related variable that is that has been shown to relate to difficulties in speech planning. In this case, we're going to use lexical frequency and another measure of predictability, but for now, let's just think about lexical frequency. So there's lots of studies that have shown since the 60s and even before that if a word has a lower lexical frequency, it takes longer to initiate saying it. And this has been shown in reading and in object naming. So that's going to be our proxy for planning difficulty. Secondly, we find an alternation with a target and a trigger in separate words. In this case, flapping, as I've been talking to you about, we're going to focus only on T, flaps derived from T. But in principle, this could be any process that applies across word boundaries or planning units of other kinds. And thirdly, you can take these two pieces and then do a corpus analysis to find correlations between these two things, right? So what's the correlation between the use of this particular variant and the frequency of the words in the phrase? And finally, which is something I did in my 2017 thesis and the paper in Phon that came out last year. And then finally, create a production experiment to establish causation and probe the details of those correlations that I found in the corpus analysis, which is the results that were recently published in actually like 2 weeks ago in Psychonomic Bulletin and Review that you can take a look at. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about the corpus studies that I did. So these were studies of audio corpora with existing phonetic annotation. And we used some statistical modeling techniques to control for unbalanced data. These are spontaneous speech data. And one of the papers that we did was flapping in English, which was the one that's reported in Phon, that we've been talking about a lot today. Some other salient facts about flapping is that it has no lexical restrictions. Right? Basically, any word, as long as you're a word that ends in a vowel followed by a T, that T is potentially able to be flapped. And we used a proxy that's different from lexical frequency, which is predictability in context, right? So how likely is that word, not just how frequent, not how common is the word, but how likely is that word to be there given the word that's preceding it. Another study that I'll tell you about just very briefly, just as a kind of complement to this study, is Liaison in French, which this study is in my dissertation. So this process is kind of fundamentally different from flapping in that it's a process whereby the consonant at the end of a word is retained in special contexts, right? So whereas T changes into a flap in the special context, namely when there's a following vowel, in the case of Liaison, the final consonant actually usually does not appear. So it's completely gone in most contexts, unless there's a following vowel. So it's like the opposite of a reductive process in a sense, if you think about it in that way. Unlike flapping, it's heavily conditioned by morphosyntax, right? So it's only very specific words that this applies to that have this special liaison consonant at the end. And it also seems to be affected by syntax. So we only investigated this in 2 specific syntactic environments. And this is joint work that I had done with Megan Clairds and Michelle Wagner at McGill. Okay, so in terms of the planning proxies, what do we expect? So I mentioned lexical frequency already and also contextual predictability. But in general, for both of these measures, we have the exact same prediction, namely that in cases where we have a given word, right? Say we have the word great. For a given word like great, if it's paired with a lower predictability following word, for example, aardvark, which is a very uncommon word, and it's not, you're not going around telling aardvarks that they're doing a great job, then we expect it to be more likely that you have 2 separate planning units. Therefore, we have some variant other than a flap, right? It behaves as if it's not in the following vowel context. On the other hand, if we have a word like artist, we talk about great artists all the time. It's a very common phrase. Artist is a common word. In that case, we expect it to be planned as a single unit, and therefore we expect it to be much more common to have a flap in the word great when it's specifically followed by a word like artist, which is more predictable and more common. So when we looked in the Buckeye corpus of the Buckeye corpus of spontaneous speech, which is an English corpus of American speech, we found that there was a positive correlation between the predictability of the trigger word, so predictability of aardvark or artist, not of the word great, which is, so the predictability of the trigger word is here along the x-axis, and along the y-axis, you see here the likelihood of flapping, of using the flap, and you can see that there's a positive correlation between those two. So indeed, words like artist are more likely to trigger a flap than words like aardvark. And interestingly, we found very similar results in French. So in French, you see a very similar graph. So the lexical frequency of the second word in the pair along the x-axis, and along the y-axis is now percentage of liaison realized. So when they did use the consonant, and we see that there's a positive correlation between those two. And these two different plots are just from the two different syntactic environments of noun followed by adjective and adjective followed by noun, which we can talk a little bit more about during the question period if you like, but I'm just going to go ahead and wrap up this part. So what did we learn from the corpus studies? The pattern of predictability that we find is consistent with planning effects for these two different processes that I've looked at, namely flapping and also liaison in French. So what's the theoretical consequence of that? Well, I think that the explanation of phonological variation can be shared between phonology and speech planning, right? So on the one hand, we have this idea of having these different size planning units, and the idea that we can map from underlying representations to surface representations. And if we put those two things together, we can derive at least part of what we call phonological variation. So I think it's important to think about the appropriate division of labor. And the only way, I feel the only way to do that is actually to make explicit about our assumptions about the speech processing on the one hand and phonological objects on the other hand. Okay. So I've been talking for about 30 minutes. So I want to tell you now about my production experiments, and then I would love to take your questions. So let's talk about production experiments. So a question that production experiments allow us to address, as opposed to just looking at corpus data, is we can ask about the causality of the planning proxies on phonological variation. So this is work that I've been doing in my postdoc with Matt Goldrick here at Northwestern, and was recently published in Psychonomic Bulletin and Review. So what we did was, our goal was to manipulate and change the size of the planning window in order to change the distribution of the allophones, in this case, still flap, right? So if we force people to have different size planning windows, will they change the amount of flaps that they're producing? So what we had them do was produce phrases with T final adjectives and vowel initial nouns, phrases like great artist, right, which end in a T and then the next word starts in a vowel. And then we measured the proportion of flap use at the word juncture. So how often did people flap this T? And what we manipulated was response timing. So whether we asked people to start saying the words out loud right away, or whether we gave them a bit of time to read the phrase before they had to respond. And we also manipulated word level planning difficulties. So we created these phrases that had differing lexical frequencies, right? So we paired, I'll show you the item in a moment, but we had words from across the frequency spectrum. So the way we designed it was that we had people reading. So in the first condition, we had people reading aloud these adjective noun phrases immediately as soon as they popped up on the screen, and manipulated that lexical frequency as a measure of planning difficulty. We had 50 people in each condition, which we determined by power analysis, which you can take a look at on our OSF repo. And we have a bunch of other resources, including our pre-registration for this experiment on the OSF repo here. And I wanted to, actually, this is a good place to mention that I also created a PDF of these slides. So you'll be able to look at the PDF and click on all these links later. So here's an example of one of the items we created. So we had 40 items, and one item is a unit like this, right? So one item is equivalent to one adjective, and each adjective was paired with a high, medium, and low frequency noun. So complete exit, complete alter, complete antler. I flap everything because I've said these phrases so many times. And what I also tried to do is control for collocation frequency. So as you can kind of see from these phrases, these are not kind of phrases that you can imagine encountering in everyday speech. And I double checked that by looking in the Google Ngrams corpus. So some of them, you know, when I was pairing higher frequency nouns and adjectives, there were some that did appear in this corpus, but most of them just did not appear in the Google Ngrams corpus at all. The adjective could have 1, 2, or 3 syllables, but the noun always had exactly 2 syllables, and then each one had a filler or consonant, and then there were some filler items that were created with the same structure. So overall, 75% of the nouns started with a vowel, and 25% started with a consonant in the overall experiment. So in terms of the predictions, I'll walk you through these 3 quickly, and then I'll show you the results. The first prediction looks very similar to what we would expect from the corpus studies, right? So along the x-axis here, we have frequency of the noun, again, so like whether it's artist or aardvark, so low frequency nouns on the left and higher frequency nouns on the right. And then on the y-axis, again, we have flapping likelihood, and we expect to see that there's a positive correlation between those two. That's it. So if the following word is harder to plan, it takes longer to plan, then the target word should be less likely to flap. Secondly, we had some predictions about the differences between the speeded condition and the delayed condition. So here on the x-axis now I just have the difference. So now I have speeded condition and delayed condition on the right, still flapping likelihood along the y-axis. And we just expect that for any given phrase, right? So even for great artist and great artist, if you force people to start talking more quickly, as in the speeded condition, they'll be less likely to flap because they'll be more pressured to plan incrementally and use smaller planning windows. And then finally, the last prediction concerns the difference in the size of the noun frequency effect in the 2 conditions. So here on the x-axis, we have, again, the speeded condition on the left and the delayed condition on the right. But now what we have on the y-axis is the size of the noun frequency effect. So the slope of this line from this graph here. So in the speeded condition, we expect there to be a relatively large noun frequency effect because people are being forced to plan incrementally, so they're quite affected by whether the next word is difficult to plan or not. Whereas if people have time to plan in advance, the effect of the noun frequency might be mitigated. So the advantage that a frequent word like artist has over aardvark is mitigated in the delayed condition. Okay, so I have a lot of details about the acoustic analysis and the statistical analysis, but I'll just skip over this for now. We can come back to it. It's also all detailed in the paper if you want to take a more careful look later. I'll skip straight to the results. So to give you some, first to tell you a little bit about the results of the control factors, there was more flapping with a faster speaking rate. So if the speaker was speaking more quickly relative to their own speech rate, they were more likely to flap. They were more likely to flap later in the experiment. So as the experiment went on, they got more comfortable with flapping. And also adjectives flapped more when they were more frequent. So the frequency of the adjective itself affected flapping, but there was no effect of the length of the adjective. So the 1, 2, and 3 syllable adjectives did not differ in the amount of flapping. So in terms of looking at prediction 1, what we want to know, is there a positive correlation between noun frequency and flapping likelihood? And indeed there was, right? So we can see here the noun frequency on the x-axis and likelihood of flapping on the y-axis. And there's a positive correlation between the two. In the background, these gray dots that you can see are the rate of flapping for each individual phrase, right? So each item has three unique phrases in it. So these gray dots are the unique phrases. So complete exit would be somewhere around here, and then complete alter would be somewhere around here, with the phrase, the noun being more rare. And you can see that there's there's a range of flapping likelihoods, but overall we can see that there's this correlation. So that's just the first condition. So the condition where people were forced to read the phrases out loud as soon as they appeared on the screen. So we confirmed that there is a noun frequency effect and that there's more flapping with high frequency nouns, which we interpret as high frequency nouns being planned sooner. Therefore, they're more likely to be in the same window, right? You're more likely to plan you're more likely to have 2 words in your planning window when it's easy to retrieve them from memory, for example. And what this points to is that there is a variable planning window within each individual speaker, right? So this is something that is true for each individual speaker. They're affected by the frequency of the noun. So that kind of shows it's something novel, actually, to my knowledge in the world of psycholinguistics, to show that individual speakers can differ in how far in advance they're planning within the same experiment. And it also adds support to the causal explanation that I had suggested based on my corpus studies. So the next step is to do the condition 2 or experiment 2, as we called it in the paper, which is to give speakers more planning time before they're forced to respond. So in the second experiment, we gave people that extra time, which we hypothesized would increase their planning window, right? So participants had to wait between 1250 and 2000 milliseconds after seeing the phrase on the screen before responding. And the sample size target was also 50, but we actually had to cut it short due to COVID-19 restrictions. So we kind of ended up with only 42 participants from the lab. So it turns out that experiment 2 in this delayed condition, all of the control factors stayed exactly the same. And as for the noun frequency effect, we saw a similar looking slope, but in terms of once all the other factors were taken into account, there was actually not a significant relationship between noun frequency and flapping likelihoods in this condition. So the crucial part of experiment 2 was to be able to compare it with experiment 1. So that was our second prediction, right? So we predicted that there would be more flapping for the delayed responses, and that was borne out overall, right? So in the speeded condition, we had kind of under 20% flapping overall. And then for the exact same phrases, right, for these other participants who were in the delayed condition, they were at about 30% flaps on average, right? So just the fact of letting them see the phrase a little bit in advance for up to 2 seconds caused the speakers to flap more, which confirmed the second prediction. As for the size of the noun frequency effect here, so we had our prediction was that the speeded condition would have a greater noun frequency effect. We already saw kind of something towards that that kind of hints at that, right? So in the speeded condition, actually, I'm sorry, this number is incorrect. It should be 0.16. But in the speeded condition, the estimate was 0.16 for the noun frequency effect size. And you can still see, so these individual gray dots now are individual speakers. So the offset of the random slope for an individual speaker. So for every individual speaker, they have a positive slope for this noun frequency effect. What happens in the delayed condition is quite different. Apologies, this graphic is also not updated. So this on this side, it's not significant, and it's should be 0.05 here. So what we see is a difference. The participants are much more scattered, right? Some participants do seem to have a strong noun frequency effect in this condition, but others are much closer to 0. And there's not an effect that's reliably different from 0 in this case. And if you create a pooled model with both experiment 1 and experiment 2 data, there's a significant interaction between condition and noun frequency. So they're significantly different. All right. So to wrap up this part, if we look back at prediction 1, flapping, we saw that it is indeed the case that flapping is more likely when the following word is frequent, which we interpret as a larger planning window being more likely. And flapping is more likely when speakers have more time for planning before speaking begins, which we interpret as the larger planning window being more likely. And finally, for prediction 3, we see that the effect of the following words frequency is smaller when speakers have more time for planning, which we interpret as the larger planning window already being more likely in the case of the delayed condition. So what this phonological variation reveals is a dynamic planning window within individuals. And so we can also think about it in the other way, in the phonological way, by saying phonological variation is partly attributable to variation in the speech planning window. Oh, and I also have my little self-advertisement here that we're actually currently running a within participant replication. So we have participants do both the speeded and the delayed conditions within a single experiment via online platform. So stay tuned for results of that. So indeed, the production planning hypothesis, as I formulated earlier, seems to be supported by these experimental results. And if we think about the production planning hypothesis from a psycholinguistic perspective, we also find support for the idea that variation in the speech planning window is leading to some specific patterns of phonetic variation. So some conclusions on phonological variation. Variation in the speech planning window can explain the distribution of phonological variation. So why is it the case that we have very little variation when the segment in question is inside a word, as opposed to much more variation when the segment that we're investigating is at the edge of a word? Well, there's more uncertainty across word boundaries, right? It's very unlikely that you would plan a single word in 2 production chunks, right? There seems to be something that's a unit about these words based on, this, I think in almost any theory of speech production, a word, whatever that means, I mean, Anglo-European language-centric notion of word is a privileged unit in speech processing. So it seems very unlikely that it would be planned in 2, it would be separated for the purposes of speech production, whereas something that depends on information in a separate word could very plausibly be in 2 separate planning units. And phonological alternations provide evidence for a dynamic scope of speech planning. So we have this kind of novel result that speech planning is dynamic within individuals. And I think what this highlights is the need to understand speaker internal sources of variability when we're trying to provide an analysis of this phonologically defined phenomenon of phonological variation. Lastly, I want to come back to this idea of the joint approach of specifying our hypotheses in both the space of phonology and the space of speech production. I think that as I'm in general kind of, we can't get away from making implicit assumptions, whichever side of this complex diagram we think that we're on. We can't get away from making assumptions about what the units of speech production are, or how phonological knowledge is actually cashed out during speech. And I think that can really lead to some misinterpretations or overinterpretations in the observation and assessment stage. So making explicit choices for each of these domains before experimentation is going to allow us to make a more nuanced assessment when we get there. So just some closing thoughts about the joint approach itself. If we think about this from the perspective of phonology, what can we gain? We can think about an explicit framework for how and when phonological knowledge comes to be used, or at least some constraints about how phonological knowledge comes to be used. We can also distribute the explanatory burden for quote unquote real speech data over several cognitive processes, which we know must exist anyway, right? So I think recently in the past few decades, there's been a return towards getting back into the messiness of this real speech data and trying to take some responsibility as phonologists for fine-grained patterns. And I think that that's very admirable, but we also have to think about all the other cognitive processes that go into creating that beautiful, messy, intriguing data. And once we do that, once we kind of try to think about correctly distributing the explanatory burden for that messy data, we can avoid overcomplicating phonological theories just for the sake of data matching, right? In some cases, we might want to, we definitely want to change and evolve our theories, but we don't want to do it just for the sake of being able to match the statistics of our data. And in the final thought in this category is kind of, one way I think about this is towards a more principled competence performance distinction, right? If we want to say that some things in the data are performance, well, we need to have a good, a plausible reason or a principled way of deciding which aspects are competence related and which aspects are performance related. In terms of the perspective from speech production, I think that making very clear assumptions, adopting explicit assumptions about phonological knowledge can give us clearly defined units of analysis when we're trying to think about speech production and speech in general. And we can access insights about abstract representations and the mapping between those representations and their actual acoustic realizations. So for example, just allophones or the mapping, from underlying representations to surface representations is not something that is talked about or taken advantage of in speech production literature generally, broadly speaking. We also create, or we can also gain new measures for hypothesizing about, right? So I've here introduced flap as one of the measures, which I measured through voicing, but also Matt Goldrick has done a lot of work measuring VOT and has, really pushed the boundaries of speech production models by thinking about how voice onset times change. And there's like nobody else measuring voice onset times in this literature, barely. And finally, we can avoid misinterpreting existing measures if we stop and think about the articulation of individual sounds, for example. What does reaction time mean when your word starts with a stop versus when your word starts with a vowel, right? Which is something that Kawamoto and his colleagues have talked about quite a lot. So those are my closing thoughts. I say thank you again for inviting me, and thank you to my research assistant Chandana and all my collaborators. Yeah, and I invite questions and discussions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Oriana, for that interesting talk. And yes, questions are welcome now.
May I have the first question, please?
Sure.
Oriana, on slide 32, I believe you've shown the difference between speeded and delayed conditions. Can we go back there? Because I understood that's actually 31. Could we look at 32?
Yeah, I think this is my.
This was 31 then. So when you said it's a speeded versus delayed conditions, you did not mean the speed, but you meant the planning, right?
Yeah, so what I mean, yeah, speeded condition means that it was a condition in which the participants saw the phrase and had to read it out loud immediately.
Okay.
So it's just the name of the condition, not how fast they actually did it.
All right. I was also thinking of the units that you've mentioned at the end. You've said that there is going to be there's wide and narrow planning window. Is production planning hypothesis by any chance interested in the like minimum and maximum number of words for wide or for narrow planning window? Can you establish it somehow?
Yeah, so that's that was my question. So I, very early on when I kind of was thinking about this hypothesis, I was like, oh, wouldn't it be great? Let me just go and find out. Like, I'll just go and look in the literature, and the literature will tell me like what's the minimum size, what's the maximum size, and then I will have a very clear idea. Yeah, it turns out that that's not something we that's clear yet in anybody's theory of speech production. So I mean I think what what I'm doing is kind of, I think this study kind of adds to the body of knowledge, right? Like, what is the minimum size? What is the maximum size? I think this is kind of part of the question. It's like, sometimes it's as small as one word, and sometimes it's larger than one word. that's as far as I've gotten. And I think the other complication is that it's kind of misleading to talk about the planning window. I think there must be like multiple planning windows corresponding to the multiple levels of structure that have to be planned in speech. Yeah. So, you know, at least one for phonology and one for syntax, right? So syntax has to be planned over a wider window than individual phonology of individual words. And maybe there's even some more fine-grained distinctions within. So for example, Alan Kawamoto's work argues that there's like a kind of segment by segment approach. There's like some aspects of word planning that is really like each individual segment is planned in tandem. So that's how small you might get.
And since I'm holding the floor, let me also ask a question about production planning hypothesis, because as planning proxies for today's two experiments, you've taken probability of a word, right? And I was wondering, just theoretically, what would be the treatment if you take, say, age as one of the proxies? Because we have seen that it could be rate, right, pauses, the typical linguistic variables which are associated with predictability. But I was wondering, because there's literature, for instance, Raymond et al. 2006, about deletion, that young speakers, they tend to have more of deletion, for instance. What would be the stance of
oh, that's interesting. Okay, so age, like actual age of the speaker.
Yeah.
So I don't know a lot about, for example, cognitive differences between you know, older and younger speakers. But given that they're, you know, given any independent way of establishing like a large, that, you know, certain kinds of speakers tend to have a larger planning window versus like a smaller planning window, that should also correlate with the pattern of flapping. So for example, the two studies that I mentioned early on that said maybe there are speaker differences in window size, like one of them actually did a post hoc, they kind of post hoc split up speakers into people who had more errors versus fewer errors within the experiment. And it kind of looked like they there were differences in planning window between those two groups, and then the other group did also, they split them up into fast responders versus slow responders. So, you know, we would expect in those kinds of experiments to have, if you have any independent measure that correlates with the size of the planning window, you should see that play out in the patterns of the phonetic patterns as well. And then another thing I wanted to say is kind of, there's definitely a lot of room for incorporating like more sociologically based variable, right? So we know that like variation itself can be conditioned by sociological factors like age or gender or whatever group affiliation. And I think that's definitely an important part of, if we're trying to kind of explain speech and like how speech occurs in communities and the pattern of speech in communities, that's a crucial thing to consider. But from the perspective of the production planning hypothesis, I think what's predicted, or what's important, or what's predicted for that is that within individual speakers, these correlations hold. So this is not something that should kind of, like, it should hold at the level of each individual person. So that if I'm a person, so there's like, somebody brought up people from Connecticut. So there's like young women in Connecticut glottalize an unusual amount. Like this is something that they do a lot. So overall, they're going to do a lot less flapping. But we still predict that when they do flap, they're going to be more likely to do it with the high frequency words versus low frequency words, for example. So same with speakers by age, right? If younger people tend to do this pattern more often overall, they should still show this differing distribution within yeah, based on the production, whatever the planning proxy is.
And the argument is not actually from cognitive sciences, it's about motor abilities. So the rationale behind it is that older people have problems articulating simply. There are other people with questions. I want to dominate the discussion.
Yes, so there's Zosia Marish waiting, for example.
And Jeff.
I'm pretty sure Jeff was first.
Okay, thanks. I think I probably was too. So, I mean, this is interesting. I guess we're seeing how production planning can affect phonological behavior, really. And I wonder if there's any way of reversing that and seeing whether you could have phonological factors affect the planning, and if there's any way of doing that. Because I'm thinking that the fact that all these following words begin with a vowel is probably going to have some effect on how speakers plan the production, as opposed to like Great Gatsby or something like that, where clearly there's going to be some, like if there's a stop that comes after the final stop, then it would think it would have an effect on planning. And I guess my question is whether it's possible to try to reverse the analysis in some way, to look at that. Is, you know, if you make planning somehow your dependent variable and use some sort of phonological variation, phonological factors to try to address that.
Yeah, I think that there's I'm trying to remember, there's this like paper at the edge of my memory that kind of was thinking about a similar idea, but the kind of way I would think about it is there could be a sound or a situation where you can't, like, there's just no, like, there's no default option, right? So if you don't know what comes next, then it's ineffable, right? You can't plan it in the absence of a following sound. So the particular situation we're looking at here with T, right? You can say T, like T, if you don't know what's coming up next, you can kind of pretend it's in a neutral context or a sentence final context, let's say, right? You can't, there's lots of options for how to pronounce a T in the absence of a following vowel. It just can't be a flap. As long as it's not a flap, it can be like a T, it can be a release, it can be, you know, a glottal stop, whatever. But yeah, I wonder what would happen in a situation where there's a sound or there's some kind of aspect of the word form that you can't decide on without knowing what sound is coming up next. And in that case, do people consistently behave as if they have a larger planning window? Is that along the lines of what you were thinking?
Yeah, well, I guess I'm wondering whether it's even feasible to because, like, I mean, you kind of have an indirect way of discovering the planning window by looking at word frequency and things like that. And I'm wondering if it's even feasible to really get inside and see planning kind of directly, and whether the phonological factors, like whether the next word starts with a vowel or a consonant, is going to affect that, and whether that's, I'm wondering, I mean, if that's even possible is really a question.
Yeah, that's intriguing.
Well, that was
if
what
only we can get inside.
Pose an intriguing question. So.
Yes. Well done.
Okay, Zosia's turn now.
So I'm thinking of Jeff's problem, and I don't know if that is where you were going, but maybe the predictability, the probability of the upcoming segment might be one kind of a variable here, but I don't know if this goes in that direction. But I wanted to ask you, Oriana, thank you for a great talk about prosody, because that's my thing.
Yeah.
So if you think of hypotheses such as Eilert-Turk's smooth signal redundancy hypothesis, so they suggest that prosody, which is kind of like information theory inspired approach to, you may say, speech planning as well. So they suggest that prosody encodes predictability, which you use as a proxy for your variables of interest, right? So, so my question is, I guess, how do you treat prosody here? Because if you say explanation of phonological variation can be shared between phonology and speech planning, then I am wondering if the very interface between these two, phonology and speech planning, is not prosody. So, and if prosody is that interface, what are the kind of empirical consequences for you? Do you look at prosodic acoustic features? Do you look at, I don't know, how prosodic phrasing in your corpora is kind of interfacing between these two things? So that was a thing that was kind of in my head when I was listening to your talk.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I can tell you that prosody is kind of also where I started. Like, this is where, in the before times when I was a phonologist and I thought I could solve this with phonological tools, I thought, let's think about prosody and variable phrasing, and so okay, there's lots of ways of lots of interesting things to address in your question. So let me just say about prosody itself and looking at prosodic factors in the data. So I was very careful, or as careful as I could be in all of my studies, to not confound prosody with any of the variables that I'm trying to look at. So in the absence of any, independent, any kind of independent pointers to where the prosodic boundaries are in English or French, which I looked at, I tried to use acoustic proxies as controls in various ways, right? So we have, I have speech rate as kind of catch-all for lots of different things, but also controlled for pauses, which are kind of the most obvious marker of prosodic boundaries, but also lengthening in certain parts of the word in lots of my studies. So to the extent that I have tried to control as much as possible for the acoustic correlates of prosody, and then beyond that still found a correlation between predictability and flapping, or the dependent variable, I think that I'm still convinced that there's something there beyond prosody. So beyond just saying like these are all prosodic phrasing effects, like we can just explain this as through like prosodic phrasing is blocking flapping or whatever process, and it's not in this case. I have this kind of quite careful analysis of a corpus of spontaneous Japanese, which I did early on, which kind of really convinced me of that. So I don't think it's not quite, there's not really any path to follow in that direction, because part of the answer when we're talking about prosody is to say like, okay, well, flapping or whatever process applies within this domain, but not across this domain. And I haven't found any cases where that provides a satisfactory explanation of what's happening in the data. So that's one case. So I don't think that there's like an explanation just there. Now, what you said about prosody being the interface, like that's completely intriguing, because that's a thought that's been floating around in my mind for a really long time, right? So if you think about like, where does prosody fit in the picture of speech production? It's something that seems to happen over a quite wide domain, right? Because you have to know, like when you start articulating, for example, for your intonational contour to sound right, you need to know in advance like how many words your sentence is going to have. and how many intonational phrases and how many accentual phrases there are inside of it. For example, in Japanese, there's this beautiful evidence of like the down step happening between intonational phrases, and like somehow speakers manage this really like long-term broad information. So it seems like it's happening on a wide, like within a quite wide window. But on the other hand, there are some aspects of phonology, namely segmental phonology, like the nitty-gritty detail that seems to be happening on much smaller scale. And I think that I don't know yet what the answer is, and if there's any studies that you know of that point towards this or that have any evidence in this domain, what the relationship is between prosodic units and planning units. So the only kind of investigations I can think of in that regard are the work of Linda Wilden and her colleagues, including Hilary Wen and Aditi Lahiri, have argued that the prosodic word itself is a privileged unit in speech production, mostly from results in Dutch and English. And then there's like one other paper that says maybe the prosodic phrase, so like two phonological words, prosodic phrase which contains two phonological words might have some kind of privileged status. But other than that, I don't know anything directly about the relationship between what the size of a planning unit might be and what the prosodic units are. But I think it's really fascinating, and I think that there has to be some correspondence. Like it would make sense for there to be. And then finally, to come back to the beginning of your question relating about the smooth signal redundancy hypothesis, which I've spent some time thinking about. I think that's like, that there's a lot to like about that hypothesis, and it makes sense. And it also maybe works towards explaining some of that connection between the production and the prosodification of the planning of a particular utterance and the prosodification of a particular utterance, and how that relates to audience design. But I don't think it wholly subsumes, like it doesn't fully subsume and explain the effects that we're seeing here. But in terms of elaborating a picture of like all of speech, like yes, we're definitely going to need those kinds of explanations to understand all of the intimate details of of the speech that speakers actually produce. So there's lots of things, right? So in another talk, I have this slide of like a little brain in the middle, and then like all the different things that we need to take into account if we want to understand the output of that brain, right? So like social factors, like what kind of group are you trying to affiliate with is also going to be important as to whether you produce a flap or not. Or like I have the variant, like there's, the ing variant, the ing morpheme. Whoa, that was a weird speech here. The ing morpheme has this like, there's this like pronunciation that's coming from California and like spreading throughout young people. And I kind of have it like talking as opposed to talking. And it comes out sometimes and I can't decide when. So if I had to just like explain when I would say talking versus talking, I would have to take all these factors into account, and probably the following phonological context as well is just as important. So that's my kind of very broad answer, is that I think there's like this whole concept, so that this circle is this is a very limited loop, and there's many more circles that should be here, like all circled up together.
I understand.
It's just
may I have do I have time to just quickly respond, or do you want to go on with the question time?
Well, Camille is waiting, but I guess we can afford.
No, it was useful stuff. So I agree absolutely with you that that of course the amount of variance that prosody explains is huge, but still there are some predictability effects. Even if you, if you control for prosody, there is always some kind of independent main effect that you can find, however small, right? So I guess in your type of work, this is what you are looking at. That's how I understood it. yeah, but to me, what is intriguing to me is precisely these thoughts that I guess I can only tell you. I can think of Alistair as a person that definitely thought a lot about this interface, prosody as interface, as something that, you know, that prosody is as she claims, a grammaticalization, you know, like you over the evolution of the language, or you know, prosody grammaticalizes predictability effects in essence, right? So that's the kind of the basis of the interface. And yeah, this is something that really interests me, and we can talk further about this. And we have a publication in Frontiers about typological differences between different prosodic systems, how that is kind of evidence that predictability effects also vary according to different prosodic types. So yeah, it's I agree.
That's fascinating.
It's a huge topic. So yeah, let's leave it.
Thanks so much for your question.
Thank you both. And now Camille's turn.
Okay, thanks Oriana for the great talk. I'm really glad I got to hear it. I have a question about predictability. And one proxy for, or one measure of predictability that has kind of intrigued me, which is so Scott Seyfarth in 2014 has shown that kind of the reverse predictability, or the predictability of like word 1 from word 2 is a strong is a good predictor of reduction processes. And I think this effect bears scrutiny also in other data sets. So I'm curious how that would square, if at all, with planning window approach to variable phonological processes. Is there any way in which like kind of the reverse direction can be factored into your kind of modeling? And or maybe you've looked at it already and know that this is not the case. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, no, thanks. Thanks for the question. Yeah, so I've thought most deeply about just the frequency of word 1. Okay, so we have to define our terms, right? So we have, if we are talking about, just to give a concrete example, where's my, okay, here. So if we're talking about a pair of words like great artist, right? Word 1 being great. And this is where we're looking for the acoustic effect, right? Like the reduction, for example. Is that right about Scott's, what Scott had looked at? I'm not sure, I'm not sure I fully recall the details of that paper, but I will just try to talk through it. So word 1 and word 2. So I've been mainly concerned with frequency of word 2, right? Because I care about, like, the hypothesis is really about the availability of this word, like artist versus aardvark. So I've looked at the frequency of word 2, the frequency of word 2 given word 1. So given, can you all see my mouse, or am I pointing for no reason?
Yep, yeah, it's visible.
Okay, great. Okay, good. So the frequency of word 2, I have predictions about. The frequency of word 2 given word 1, that's like kind of the contextual predictability that I looked at in the corpus. And then Camille, if I understand correctly, what we're asking about is, well, what about the frequency of word 1, given word 2?
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that the answer is similar to the answer I would give just about the frequency of word 1. So the frequency of, which is this. So the more frequent a word is, the more quickly you get to the stage where you finish planning it, right? So just in a single word context, the word great, it's a common word, it's a great word. It's very frequent. So we plan it much more quickly than we would another random word like aardvark, which is less frequent. So we get to the point of being able to articulate it sooner. Now the question is, what does that mean that once we get to the point of articulating it, we must send it away to be articulated, in which case we might actually suffer more from like window effects, because we don't have time to wait for the next word to become available, right? So more frequent words, so this is for production, right? So a more frequent word will actually end up being in its own little bubble by itself sooner, because you just plan it sooner. So just might as well send it away to be articulated. And then it has to be articulated in the absence of knowledge of what comes next. And I think that that doesn't seem to be what happens. I'll just say that. So we thought about this for a long time. So it doesn't seem to be what happens. In terms of so if the word one is more likely given word two, that seems to imply that you know something about, where there's something about the planning of word two itself that facilitates the planning of word one, or that at least if we're talking about reduction, I'm actually not sure what the implications are. So there might be a different kind of relationship with reduction, but so if the frequency of, so if the frequency of this word in the context facilitates word one, I guess it's not clear what it's going to do to the planning window. The long and short answer is it's not clear. And I think we need to investigate more. I haven't looked at it directly. I could, could go back into the corpus and take a look at what happens. The complicating factor being that, the more of these predictability measures you put in, like they're all kind of correlated with each other. So maybe another experiment would be the way to go. I didn't control for this, the predictability in this case, but as I tried to control for it in the sense that I tried to make these phrases very unpredictable in any context. Yeah, good question though.
Camille, have you got another question or?
Sorry, I just forgot to lower that hand.
Okay.
I see that I had a question in the chat that I just like to quickly address because it's an easy one with a great answer. So the flapping likelihood. So I used a couple of different terms for in my y-axis of the dependent measure. So flapping likelihood is the question is whether that's different from when I say predicted probability of flapping, and those are kind of referring to the exact same thing. So flapping likelihood is just kind of the general cover term, like whether I'm talking about like what it looks like in the empirical data or what's being predicted, whereas predicted probability of flapping is specifically what I mean when I'm talking about model results. So predicted probability of flapping for a particular model.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. And I assume there are no more questions now, or am I wrong? Okay. If not, then we would like to thank you very much for that inspiring talk, and for inspiring so many questions here. Thank you so much for coming to Poznań virtually and sharing your ideas with us. And yes, let's clap our hands, I suppose.
Thank you again for inviting me. It's been wonderful to be here, and I'm happy to continue the conversation by email or on Twitter. If you have any more ideas or thoughts, please don't hesitate to contact me, and I will share the slides for this talk.
Okay.
If I may, about sharing, it's a question actually to all the audience that I'm very glad to see also my students here among the audience. Would you guys prefer to have Oriana's talk as streaming on the faculty's website or posted on the YouTube channel? If you want to access the lecture for future reference. Or do you leave it up to me?
I guess both ways are easy to access, so
Okay.
so whatever you choose will be fine. I would also like to use this opportunity to thank Gosia for organizing the talk with Akademicki Poznań for getting the sponsorship. Thank you, Gosia.
And I would like to thank the city, of course. And the mayor of city of Poznań.
Of course, we are grateful to the city, and we have acknowledged their participation as well. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you.